The cold steel of handcuffs locked around his wrists. A 12-year-old boy yanked from the crowd, his voice shaking as he cried out, "I didn't do anything." But no one listened. A single accusation. No evidence. Yet he now faced a courtroom that could steal his future forever. With the odds stacked against him, only one person dared to fight for the truth. But when the truth is finally exposed, will justice prevail? Do you believe a single lie can destroy a child's future? What if this happened to your family? Share your thoughts below. Now let's dive into this gripping story, a fight for justice that you won't soon forget. The soft hum of classical music filled the air, blending seamlessly with the quiet murmur of well-dressed customers browsing the glass cases. Inside Carter & Co., one of New York's most prestigious jewelry stores, diamonds and gold shimmered under the warm glow of chandelier lights. The scent of polished wood and expensive cologne lingered in the air, a place where wealth felt at home and outsiders didn't belong. Near the front display, Daquan Bennett, a 12-year-old boy, stood with his hands tucked into his hoodie pocket. His eyes were fixed on a silver bracelet, sleek and simple, resting on a velvet cushion. It reminded him of the one his mom used to wear, the one she had to pawn when money got tight. He wasn't planning to buy anything. He wasn't even supposed to be here. He was just looking. Then, a voice, sharp as a blade. "Cops! Stop him! He's stealing!" The word slammed into him like a punch to the chest. Heads turned. A store employee pointed straight at him, her face twisted in alarm. Daquan's heart lurched. He hadn't moved, hadn't even lifted a finger. But in that moment, it didn't matter. Footsteps, heavy, fast, unstoppable. Before he could react, a strong hand clamped down on his arm, tight, rough, final. Officer Daniel Mallister. "Gotcha, kid." His voice was low, filled with authority. A murmur rippled through the store. A businessman in a navy suit whispered something to his wife. An elderly woman shook her head. A teenage girl reached for her phone, then hesitated, lowered it, and turned away. Daquan's chest tightened. No, this wasn't happening. "Wait, I didn't." His words came out in broken gasps, but they were swallowed by the weight of accusation. Mallister's grip only tightened. "We'll let the evidence do the talking." A security guard walked up, nodding toward Daquan like he was already guilty. "That's him?" Mallister gave a curt nod. "Yeah, caught him red-handed." But there were no red hands, no stolen bracelet, just a terrified boy and a crime that never happened. Outside, the city pulsed with life, unbothered, unaware. A taxi honked. A man laughed into his phone. The world kept moving. But right there, on a crowded sidewalk, in broad daylight, a small boy stood frozen in the middle of his worst nightmare. Mallister spun him around, shoved him against the store window. The glass vibrated under his weight. Cold steel clamped around his wrists. "No, please," Daquan gasped, his small frame trembling. He turned, scanning the faces around him, searching for one kind soul, one voice willing to stand up for him. Nothing. "I didn't do anything." His voice cracked, high and raw. But the world had already made up its mind. No one listened. The station was cold. Not just the air, but the feeling. A place where warmth didn't exist. Daquan sat on a hard plastic bench, his small frame hunched, arms wrapped around himself. The cuffs had left faint red marks on his wrists. He traced them with trembling fingers, as if trying to erase them. His hoodie felt damp against his skin, heavy with sweat and fear. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh white light over a world that didn't care. Every sound seemed too loud. The rustling of papers, the distant murmur of voices, the sharp clack of a police officer's boots against the tiled floor. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe if he sat still, if he didn't cry, if he didn't make a sound, someone would realize. Someone would let him go. Then, a voice, calm but cold. "Kids like him, they all end up in the system sooner or later." Across the room, two officers stood near the counter. One, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, leaned against the desk, arms crossed. He didn't bother lowering his voice. The younger officer beside him glanced at Daquan, just for a second. Then he looked away. Daquan lowered his head, pressing his nails into his palms. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. He was 12. He had done nothing wrong. And yet, they had already decided his future. The station was cold. Not just the air, but the feeling. A place where warmth didn't exist. Daquan sat on a hard plastic bench, his small frame hunched, arms wrapped around himself. The cuffs had left faint red marks on his wrists. He traced them with trembling fingers, as if trying to erase them. His hoodie felt damp against his skin, heavy with sweat and fear. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh white light over a world that didn't care. Every sound seemed too loud. The rustling of papers, the distant murmur of voices, the sharp clack of a police officer's boots against the tiled floor. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe if he sat still, if he didn't cry, if he didn't make a sound, someone would realize, someone would let him go. Then, a voice, calm but cold. Kids like him? They all end up in the system sooner or later. Across the room, 2 officers stood near the counter. One, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, leaned against the desk, arms crossed. He didn't bother lowering his voice. The younger officer beside him glanced at Daquan, just for a second. Then he looked away. Daquan lowered his head, pressing his nails into his palms. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. He was 12. He had done nothing wrong. And yet, they had already decided his future. Outside, the night air hung thick and heavy, suffocating. But nothing was as heavy as the barrier between a desperate mother and her son. Patricia Bennett wasn't moving. Her hands were pressed against the front desk, fingers trembling, her breath coming in quick, panicked gasps. She had been screaming, pleading, but her voice was breaking now. "I need to see my son. Please." The officer behind the desk barely looked up. Tired, indifferent. "Ma'am, step back." The words were routine, mechanical, like he was telling her to move out of a checkout line at the grocery store. Patricia shook her head. No. She wouldn't step back. Her baby was inside. Alone. Scared. Accused of something he didn't do. She clutched her purse against her chest, as if holding herself together. Tears burned at the edges of her eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't fall apart. Not now. Behind her, Jerome Bennett stood like stone. He hadn't spoken since they arrived. Hadn't moved, but his fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His jaw was locked, shoulders squared. His eyes stayed fixed on the entrance to the station. Breathing slow, controlled, too controlled. A younger officer stepped forward hesitantly. "You can't see him yet," he said, softer than the first. Patricia's breath hitched. "Yet?" She looked at the officer's face, searching for some trace of humanity, something to hold on to. "He's just a child." Her voice was barely above a whisper now. For a brief second, something flickered in the officer's eyes. Regret, guilt, doubt, but it was gone as quickly as it came. His posture straightened, his expression hardened, walls back up. Just another protocol. "Ma'am, please go home." Patricia let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a bitter laugh. Go home? Her son was in there, locked away like a criminal, and they expected her to just leave? The silence stretched too long. Then Jerome spoke. His voice was low, steady, dangerous in its calm. "We're not going anywhere." The officer's jaw tensed, but so did Jerome's. And in that moment, this wasn't just about Daquan. It was about every black parent who had ever stood on this side of a police barricade, begging to be heard. The night air grew colder. Inside, Daquan sat alone, staring at the floor, waiting for someone, anyone, to save him. The interrogation room was small, dimly lit, and smelled of stale coffee and old paperwork. The walls, dull and lifeless, seemed to shrink inward, pressing the silence deeper into Daquan's chest. He sat stiffly in the metal chair, his arms wrapped around himself. He barely moved, barely breathed. His fingers traced the faint red marks on his wrists where the cuffs had been. Evidence of his guilt, that's what they saw. Then, the door creaked open. A woman in a navy blue suit stepped inside. Confident, controlled, but not cold. She didn't look at him like the officers did. She didn't tower over him. Instead, she sat down. Across the table, she folded her hands, studying him, not with suspicion, but with understanding. "Daquan?" she said. Her voice wasn't soft, but it wasn't harsh either. It was steady, certain. The boy flinched. No one had said his name like that since he got here. "My name is Miranda Cole." Daquan's breath caught in his throat. He lifted his eyes just for a moment before dropping them back to the table. Miranda leaned in slightly. Not too much, just enough to meet him where he was. "I'm your attorney." Silence. Daquan's stomach twisted. He'd heard the officers talk. They said he didn't stand a chance. Miranda let the silence sit for a beat longer, then said, gently but with quiet power, "Kobe, chungtase chungmin suthat." For the first time since this nightmare began, hope flickered. The courtroom was suffocating. It wasn't the air, it was the weight of it, the heavy stares, the unspoken judgment. Daquan sat at the defense table, hands locked together in his lap. His feet barely touched the floor. The judge's bench towered above him, as if it were the only thing in the room that mattered. The jury sat still, expressions unreadable. Reporters lined the back row, pens poised, waiting for a headline. At the prosecution's table, James Grayson adjusted his tie. He moved with precision, deliberate, controlled. A man who knew he was already winning. Rising slowly, he buttoned his suit jacket before stepping forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, practiced, heavy with certainty. He turned slightly, letting his gaze fall on the jury before flicking, ever so briefly, toward Daquan. "The facts in this case are simple." He took a step closer. The defendant was caught at the scene. A stolen bracelet, valued at thousands of dollars, was found inside his backpack. He let the words settle, the weight of them hanging in the air like a noose. "All the evidence points to him, there is no doubt." Grayson's eyes swept over the jury one last time before returning to his seat. He adjusted his tie, as if the case was already closed. Silence. Then, all eyes shifted to Daquan. The boy who had once been so full of life, so eager to explore, now sat motionless. His hands gripped his knees beneath the table, knuckles white, his shoulders curled inward, as if trying to make himself smaller. He kept his head down, staring at the table's smooth surface. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. It didn't matter what he said. It didn't matter that he had never even touched the bracelet. To them, he was already guilty. In the jury box, a man folded his arms, expression blank. A woman glanced at Daquan, then quickly looked away. Somewhere behind him, a spectator shifted in their seat. A cough broke the silence. The room held its breath. Daquan squeezed his eyes shut, and for the first time, he wondered if fighting back was even worth it. The courthouse stood like a fortress, its stone facade towering, cold and indifferent. The sun was bright, but it did nothing to warm the heavy tension that loomed over the steps. Outside, chaos reigned. Reporters swarmed like vultures, their cameras flashing, their voices rising in a frantic storm of questions. The street hummed with tension, packed with protesters, curious onlookers, and those who had already made up their minds. The case had gripped the city. A 12-year-old black boy on trial for theft, the kind of story that stirred debates on the news, ignited outrage on both sides, and drew lines in the sand. The headlines screamed from newspapers held tightly in reporters' hands: child thief or criminal mastermind, justice or special treatment, too young to be guilty, too black to be innocent. Daquan hadn't read them. He didn't need to. He could feel them. The weight of judgment pressed down from all sides. As he stepped from the police transport, the noise swallowed him whole. "Miss Cole, do you really think you can win this case? Mr. Bennett, what do you have to say about your son's arrest? Should a 12-year-old be tried like an adult?" The questions weren't directed at him, but he felt every word stab into his skin like tiny daggers. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. The cuffs were gone, but he still felt them. And then he heard it. A single voice, sharp, full of anger, cut through the crowd like a blade. "Lock him up." It was just one voice, then another and another, until it became a storm, a chant that rippled outward like a tide, rising, growing, consuming. "Lock him up! Lock him up!" The words hit harder than any punch. Daquan's breath hitched, his chest tightened, his legs felt like they weren't his own, heavy, unsteady. The courthouse steps stretched before him, endless, each one harder to climb than the last. Beside him, Miranda Cole walked with purpose, her shoulders squared, her grip firm but steady on his arm. Not pulling, not dragging, but anchoring. She leaned in, voice low but strong. "Keep walking, kid." Daquan swallowed hard. His pulse pounded in his ears, louder than the chanting, louder than the world. The crowd parted just enough for him to pass. People stared, some with outright contempt, their minds already made up. Others just watched, their faces blank, unreadable. A woman in the front row clutched her purse tighter as he walked by. A man in a business suit shook his head, muttering something under his breath. A teenage girl lifted her phone, recording. But when Daquan's eyes flicked toward her, she lowered it, turned away. Somewhere in the crowd, a man whispered, "He's just a kid," but his voice was drowned out. The chanting rose and fell, like waves crashing against the shore, like a verdict already decided. Guilty. Before he even stepped inside, the courtroom was silent, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with expectation. The judge sat high above, gavel resting on polished wood. The jury sat still, eyes forward, waiting. The spectators filled the gallery, whispering among themselves, some curious, others already convinced. And at the center of it all, Daquan sat frozen. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Then James Grayson stood. The prosecutor was a man who knew how to own a room. Tall, well-dressed, he carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from years of winning. He buttoned his suit jacket with deliberate precision before stepping toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, practiced. "This is a simple case." He let the words settle. No rush, no hesitation. The defendant had a motive. He was caught at the scene. The stolen item was found in his possession. The evidence is clear. The facts are undeniable. And at the end of this trial, there will only be one conclusion: guilty. He turned slightly, just enough to glance toward Daquan, then back to the jury. Justice must be served. Then, with the same deliberate control, he walked back to his seat. The silence that followed was heavy. Daquan's hands clenched in his lap. His breath came slow, controlled. But inside, everything felt like it was unraveling. "Call your first witness." James Grayson rose again. The prosecution calls Officer Daniel Mallister to the stand. Footsteps echoed as Mallister approached, his police badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He moved with the kind of certainty that made people believe him before he even spoke. He took his seat, right hand raised, swore to tell the truth. Then he turned to the jury. "Officer Mallister," Grayson began, pacing slowly like a man in complete control. "Walk us through what happened that day." Mallister nodded, his expression serious. "I was on patrol near Carter & Co. Jewelry when I noticed the defendant acting suspiciously near the display cases. He seemed nervous, kept looking over his shoulder." He paused, letting the image sink in. A fidgety black boy, lingering near expensive jewelry. "When I approached him, he got defensive." Another pause. "I asked him to open his backpack. Inside, I found the stolen bracelet." His words landed with force, unshaken, certain. He looked at the jury, his face unreadable. His job was done. In that moment, he was not just telling the story. He was shaping the truth. Across the courtroom, Daquan stared down at his hands. Everything in him screamed to speak, to explain, to fight back. But no one had asked him a question, and no one was listening. At the back of the courtroom, Patricia Bennett held her husband's hand in a grip so tight it turned their knuckles white. Her nails pressed into his skin, but Jerome didn't flinch. He just sat there, jaw clenched, his breath coming in slow, measured inhales, controlled, but barely. Tears welled in Patricia's eyes, but she refused to blink. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry. But as Mallister spoke, as she watched the jury absorb every word as if it were law, a single tear slipped down her cheek. Jerome's fingers tightened around hers. She wanted to believe this was just the beginning, that there was time for the truth to come out. But sitting there, watching them paint her son as a criminal, it already felt like the end. For the first time since the trial began, Miranda Cole stood. She moved with deliberate control, her posture straight, her steps measured. No rush, no hesitation. But something shifted in the air. Until now, the prosecution had dictated the tempo. Their version of the story had been smooth, seamless, undisputed. But Miranda was about to change that. She approached the witness stand, eyes locked onto Officer Daniel Mallister. He sat tall, composed, his uniform crisp, his badge polished to perfection. The image of authority, of credibility. But Miranda wasn't looking at the badge, she was looking at the man wearing it. She stopped just a few feet from him, letting the silence settle. Then her voice, clear, sharp, and cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Officer Mallister, let me ask you something simple." She let the words hang for a beat, then continued. "Did you activate your body camera when you stopped Daquan Bennett?" A ripple of movement stirred through the spectators. The judge shifted slightly in her seat. The jury leaned in, just enough to show they were listening. At the prosecution's table, James Grayson's pen stopped mid-scratch against his notepad. His jaw tightened as he shot a quick glance at Mallister, brief but telling. Mallister exhaled through his nose. For the first time since he took the stand, he hesitated, just for a second, a flicker. A hesitation barely long enough to notice, but Miranda noticed. He shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping against the wooden stand, just once. A quick, nervous movement, before he answered. The camera was malfunctioning. Silence. Someone in the gallery let out a quiet scoff. One of the jurors, a middle-aged woman in a blue blazer, narrowed her eyes. Miranda tilted her head slightly, like a predator sensing weakness. Malfunctioning, she repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the word. Mallister gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. That's correct. Miranda didn't blink. So to clarify, she said, her tone smooth, the only record of Daquan's suspicious behavior is your word? A murmur rippled through the courtroom. At the prosecution's table, Grayson's fingers tightened around his pen. In the back, Patricia Bennett's nails dug into Jerome's palm. Jerome leaned forward slightly, his jaw clenching. For the first time, the story James Grayson had painted, so clear, so convincing, began to blur. And the jury felt it. They didn't say anything. They didn't have to. Because the first seed of doubt had just been planted. The courtroom door creaked open, and a woman stepped inside. She was in her late 40s, dressed in a crisp navy blouse and a beige pencil skirt, her heels clicking against the floor as she approached the witness stand. Her posture was straight, but her hands, those hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone. Eleanor Carter, the store clerk from Carter & Co. Jewelry. She had been there that day. She had seen everything. But until now, she had been silent. Miranda Cole stepped forward, offering a small, measured nod of reassurance before she spoke. Miss Carter, can you please describe what you saw on the afternoon of Daquan Bennett's arrest? Eleanor exhaled, slow and shaky. She folded her hands in her lap, as if trying to steady herself. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was softer than expected. I saw the boy enter the store. He was looking at the display cases. She hesitated, glancing toward the prosecution's table where James Grayson sat stone-faced, unreadable. Eleanor swallowed. Her fingers twisted together. I didn't see him take anything. A murmur rippled through the room. Miranda's expression remained neutral, her hands resting lightly on the podium. But in the gallery, Patricia's breath caught. Daquan looked up for the first time in minutes. Even Grayson's fingers twitched against the legal pad in front of him. Miranda let the tension hang for just a moment before she pressed forward. Miss Carter, when the police arrived, did you inform them of this? Another hesitation. Eleanor's gaze dropped. Her shoulders seemed to shrink under the weight of the question. Her voice came quieter this time. No. A sharp stillness filled the air. Miranda's tone softened, but only slightly. Why not? Eleanor's lips pressed together. She took a breath, and for a moment she seemed to struggle between past and present. Finally, her voice broke through the silence. Because I was afraid. A single sentence. But it landed like a gavel strike. In the jury box, the woman in the blue blazer shifted, her jaw tightening. James Grayson leaned back slightly, his fingers still on his pen but no longer moving. Eleanor swallowed again, her voice steadier now. When Officer Mallister arrived, everything happened so fast. He had already decided Daquan was guilty. I didn't want to get involved. I didn't want to say the wrong thing. She looked down at her hands, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of regret. But I should have said something. She exhaled, and when she lifted her eyes to the jury, there was no hesitation left. I didn't see him steal anything. I didn't see him holding anything. I should have spoken up then, but I'm speaking up now. Silence. Miranda stepped back slightly, letting the moment settle. At the defense table, Daquan blinked, his throat tight, unsure if he was breathing at all. Across the room, his mother, Patricia, let out a silent breath. A prayer, a plea, a sliver of hope. And in the jury box, for the first time, the case no longer seemed so simple. The tension in the courtroom was razor sharp. Eleanor Carter's testimony had cracked the prosecution's case, but Miranda wasn't done yet. She turned to the judge, her voice steady. Your Honor, the defense would like to call our next witness, Raymond Harris, forensic video analyst. A man in his early 40s stood and walked toward the witness stand. He carried himself with calm precision, his glasses perched neatly on the bridge of his nose, a tablet tucked under one arm. His tailored suit lacked the stiffness of the prosecution's team, but there was something in his confidence that demanded attention. After taking his oath, he settled into his chair, adjusting the microphone. Miranda stepped forward. Mr. Harris, could you please state your qualifications for the court? He gave a small nod. I have over 15 years of experience in forensic video analysis. I specialize in height approximation, motion tracking, and digital enhancement. My work has been used in both criminal and civil cases nationwide. Miranda nodded, allowing the jury to absorb his credibility before moving on. You were asked to examine the CCTV footage from Carter & Co. Jewelry on the day of Daquan Bennett's arrest. Is that correct? That's correct. She gestured toward the courtroom's large screen, where a still image from the surveillance footage appeared. A blurry figure stood near the display case, the supposed thief. Miranda's voice was sharp, clear. Mr. Harris, based on your expert analysis, is this Daquan Bennett? Harris didn't hesitate. No. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Miranda let the moment hang for just a second before continuing. How can you be so certain? Harris tapped his tablet and a second image appeared, a height comparison analysis. Lines, measurements, science. Based on multiple reference points in the footage, the shelving units, the counter, and a store employee who walked past the suspect, I conducted a height analysis. The individual seen here is at least 10 centimeters taller than Daquan Bennett. Silence. Then a shift. A stir in the jury box. The faint sound of someone clearing their throat. The press in the gallery leaning forward just a little more. The picture was changing. The version of the story that had seemed airtight was unraveling, thread by thread. At the prosecution's table, James Grayson's pen was no longer moving. His shoulders, once so assured, now held a subtle tension. Mallister sat rigid, his jaw locked. At the defense table, Daquan barely breathed. Miranda took a step back, letting the image linger on the screen, letting the truth settle in. And for the first time, the weight of guilt was shifting. The air in the courtroom had changed. It was no longer just tense, it was electric. For the first time since the trial began, James Grayson looked uneasy. Miranda Cole turned to the judge, her voice steady, but beneath it was a current of something sharper. Your Honor, the defense calls Julia Morales to the stand. A few people in the gallery exchanged puzzled glances. The name was unfamiliar, until the door at the back of the courtroom swung open. And then, a shift. A woman in her late 50s stepped inside, her presence immediately commanding. Her NYPD badge, though no longer active, still hung from a chain around her neck, a quiet reminder of who she once was. Former officer Julia Morales. She walked with the practiced confidence of someone who had spent decades in uniform, her steel-gray hair tied back, her face marked with the weight of experience. As she took her seat at the witness stand, Mallister stiffened. For the first time, his fingers curled tightly around the edges of the wooden witness box. Miranda approached, her steps measured. Ms. Morales, can you please state your history with the NYPD? Julia nodded once. I served on the force for over 25 years. I worked in patrol, investigations, and later internal affairs before I retired. Miranda nodded as if she already knew the answer. And in your years of service, did you ever work with Officer Daniel Mallister? For the first time, Mallister shifted slightly in his seat. Morales turned her gaze toward him, her expression unreadable. Yes, I did. Miranda didn't rush. She let the weight of that answer settle. Then, she pressed forward. Ms. Morales, during your time in internal affairs, did you ever investigate Officer Mallister? A ripple of movement stirred in the jury box. Morales took a slow breath before speaking. Yes. Silence. Miranda leaned slightly against the podium. Not aggressive, not forceful, just patient, waiting. And what did you find? Morales looked straight at the jury when she spoke. That Officer Mallister had a pattern of making false accusations against innocent people. And he did it to advance his career. A shockwave rippled through the room. Someone in the gallery let out a sharp exhale. In the jury box, one of the jurors leaned forward, eyes narrowing. At the prosecution's table, Grayson's jaw tightened. He started flipping through his notes, looking for something, anything, to shut this down. But he wouldn't find it. Because Miranda Cole had just shattered the foundation of their case. The courtroom was no longer just tense. It was on the edge of something. A shift, a collapse, a reckoning. Officer Mallister sat stiffly on the witness stand, his fingers gripping the wooden railing as if he could hold the case together with sheer force. But it was already crumbling beneath him. Miranda Cole turned to the judge, her voice steady, too steady. There was something dangerous about it, something sharp beneath the calm. Your Honor, The defense has one final piece of evidence to present. She walked toward the exhibit table, where a plastic evidence bag sat under protective glass. Inside, the silver bracelet, the very item that had condemned Daquan Bennett. Miranda turned, facing the jury, her words deliberate. The prosecution built this case around one core piece of evidence, that this bracelet was found in Daquan Bennett's backpack. That alone was supposed to prove his guilt. She let the silence stretch. Then, she lifted a forensic report. But facts don't lie. She stepped toward the jury, voice clear, firm, and science doesn't bend to fit a story. She held up the document. This is the forensic report on the fingerprints lifted from the stolen bracelet. A hush fell over the room. At the prosecution's table, Grayson's pen stopped mid-stroke, his jaw tightened. He knew what was coming. Miranda didn't look at him. She looked straight at Mallister. "Tell me, officer, before arresting Daquan, did you check the fingerprints on this bracelet?" Mallister's mouth opened slightly, then closed. For the first time, he had no words. He hadn't checked. Miranda took another step closer. "Would you like to know what the forensic report says?" Silence. She didn't wait for an answer. "The fingerprints on this bracelet," she lifted the report, "do not match Daquan Bennett." A shockwave rippled through the courtroom. A man in the jury box exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his chin. A woman, the one in the blue blazer who had been sitting stiffly before, leaned back, eyes widening as the weight of the moment sank in. The gallery erupted into murmurs. A reporter's pen scratched frantically against paper. At the defense table, Daquan barely breathed. Patricia Bennett let out a breath. A sob, a prayer, a release of something she had been holding in for weeks. Jerome's hands, which had been curled into fists for so long, finally relaxed. But Miranda wasn't done. She turned, her gaze now locked onto James Grayson. The prosecution claimed this was an open and shut case, that the evidence was undeniable. But now, with no physical proof linking Daquan to this crime, with eyewitness testimony contradicting Officer Mallister's account, and with the revelation of Mallister's history of false accusations, she let the weight of it all settle. Then, voice controlled but unyielding, "I ask you, Mr. Grayson, what justice would be served by continuing this case?" A long pause. Grayson didn't move. His fingers curled around the edges of his file. His shoulders, once so assured, were tight, strained. Then, resignation settled in. Slowly, he rose to his feet. His face was unreadable, but the fight had left his posture. He adjusted his tie, turned toward the judge, and spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Your Honor, the prosecution moves to dismiss all charges against Daquan Bennett." The room exploded, gasps, murmurs, the sound of tension breaking apart. A reporter rushed toward the exit, phone pressed to his ear. Patricia Bennett covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Jerome gripped her shoulder, his face turned away, but his eyes shone. At the defense table, Daquan didn't move, didn't blink. For so long, he had believed the world had already decided his fate. But now, he was free. The courtroom was still buzzing. The murmurs, the gasps, the shifting energy in the room. It was like everyone had forgotten to breathe. Then, the gavel struck. The sound echoed, silencing everything. Judge Hensley, sharp-eyed and unwavering, looked out over the courtroom before turning to Daquan. Her voice, firm yet deliberate. "Daquan Bennett, not guilty." For a moment, just a heartbeat, time seemed to freeze. Then, chaos erupted. Patricia Bennett collapsed into her husband's arms, sobbing. Her hands trembled as she covered her face, whispering a prayer of gratitude, of disbelief, of something too big to name. Jerome held her tight, his own eyes shining, his breath shaking as he exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. At the defense table, Daquan sat motionless. It took him a second, maybe two, to process the words. Not guilty. The weight he had been carrying, the crushing, unbearable weight, was gone. Miranda placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're free, kid." Daquan looked at her, his throat tightening, his vision blurring. Then he let out a breath, one he hadn't even realized he was holding. Across the room, Officer Mallister sat pale and rigid, his jaw clenched, his grip on the wooden railing so tight his knuckles turned white. He had spent years walking into courtrooms like this, sure of his authority, sure of his power. But today, he wasn't in control. Today, he was the one under scrutiny. A voice from the back cut through the murmurs. "Internal Affairs is launching an investigation." Mallister's shoulders stiffened. He didn't turn. But the weight of the truth was on him now. And this time, there was no escaping it. Hours later, when the cameras had gone, when the reporters had left, when the world outside had moved on, Daquan sat by his bedroom window, bathed in the golden glow of the afternoon sun. In his hands, a notebook. The same notebook that had sat untouched for weeks, pages empty, waiting. Slowly he picked up a pen. His fingers didn't shake this time. And on the first page, in neat, careful handwriting, he wrote, "If someone wants to change, I think I'll be the first." He paused, staring at the words, his words. Then a small smile touched his lips. His fingers brushed against the silver bracelet on his wrist. Not the one from the trial, a new one, given to him by his parents. It shimmered under the light, reflecting something new, hope. Daquan glanced outside at the world beyond the window. It was the same city, the same streets, the same world. But he wasn't the same. His gaze lifted, no longer weighed down by fear, but filled with something stronger. Determination. Because this time, he wasn't looking away. He was looking forward. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit that like button to show your support, share this video so more people can hear Daquan's journey, and subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire change. Every like, every comment, every share fuels our passion to keep bringing you meaningful content. Your support means the world to us. What are your thoughts on this story? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Subscribe now and be part of something bigger.